Tony Delucci thought being a made man meant he could disrespect anyone. On March 15, 1963, he deliberately poured wine on Bumpy Johnson's shoes to prove a point. The bill Bumpy sent him didn't just bankrupt Tony's family, it ended their place in organized crime forever. Tony Delucci walked into Vincenzo's on East 52nd Street that night with one purpose: to show Bumpy Johnson that Harlem's rules didn't apply to Little Italy's men. At 28 years old, Tony had been a made member of the Gambino family for 2 years. Long enough to develop the kind of arrogance that gets people killed. The setup had been planned for a week. Tony's crew had learned that Bumpy Johnson would be dining at Vincenzo's on March 15, 1963, in a private room with 7 of his associates. Tony volunteered to work that night, not as a legitimate waiter, but as a plant. A message from the Italian families that Harlem's independence had limits. The order came from higher up in the organization, though Tony never learned exactly who gave it. Someone wanted to test Bumpy, to see how the recently released crime boss would respond to a calculated insult from the Italians. Tony was young, ambitious, stupid enough to volunteer for the job. When Bumpy's party ordered the 1959 Barolo, Tony brought it to the table personally. He went through the ritual of presenting the bottle, uncorking it, letting Bumpy approve. The first taste. Everything proceeded normally until Tony poured the final glass at the head of the table. He tilted the bottle deliberately, letting the wine stream past the glass and onto Bumpy's custom Italian shoes. The dark red wine soaked into the tan swayed as the room went silent. Tony didn't apologize. He didn't drop to his knees with a napkin. He stood there, bottle still in hand, and met Bumpy's eyes with a slight smile that said exactly what it was. Meant to say, "We don't fear you." Bumpy looked down at his ruined shoes for a long moment. When he looked back up at Tony, his face showed no anger, no surprise, nothing but cold calculation. "What's your name?" Bumpy asked quietly. Tony told him, adding his family name with emphasis. Delucci let Bumpy know exactly who had sent the message. Bumpy nodded slowly, then returned to his meal as if nothing had happened. "Someone will be in touch about making this right," he said. Tony left the private room thinking he had accomplished his mission. He had shown disrespect and walked away. He didn't understand yet that walking away wasn't the same as surviving before. We continue. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. To understand what Tony Delucci had actually done, you need to understand the criminal landscape of New York in 1963. The 5 Italian families controlled most of Manhattan's organized crime: labor unions, construction, garbage collection, and the waterfront. They were the established power. The recognized hierarchy that law enforcement understood and, to some degree, had learned to manage. Harlem operated differently. Bumpy Johnson had returned from an 11-year sentence at Alcatraz in late 1962, walking back into a neighborhood that had changed in his absence. While he was away, the Italian families had made attempts to control Harlem's numbers, racket, and drug trade, seeing the predominantly black neighborhood as territory to be exploited rather than respected. Bumpy's return disrupted those plans. Within months, he had re-established control over Harlem's criminal economy, pushing back against Italian encroachment through a combination of violence, political connections, and strategic alliances. The Italians didn't like it, but they also recognized that Bumpy wasn't just another street criminal. He had power, connections, and the kind of intelligence that made direct confrontation expensive. The relationship between the Italian families and Bumpy's organization existed in an uneasy state. The Italians controlled Manhattan below 110th Street. Bumpy controlled Harlem. Neither side wanted an open war, but neither side wanted to appear weak. Every interaction became a negotiation. Every gesture carried weight. Tony Delucci's assignment to insult Bumpy was part of this larger tension. The Italian families wanted to test whether Bumpy would respond to disrespect from a made man. Whether he understood that attacking an Italian soldier would bring consequences he couldn't survive. It was a probe, a way of establishing boundaries. Without committing to actual violence, what the Italians miscalculated was Attesa's understanding of exactly what they were doing. He recognized the wine incident for what it was, not a personal insult from an arrogant young mobster, but a carefully orchestrated message from the families. And Bumpy's response would need to send a message back, one that established his position. Without starting a war, Bumpy had learned patience in Alcatraz. He had spent 11 years thinking about power, respect, and the precise application of force. He knew that killing Tony Delucci would bring retaliation from the Gambino family, starting a conflict that would hurt both sides. But he also knew that doing nothing would signal weakness, inviting further encroachment into Harlem. The solution Bumpy devised was elegant in its cruelty. He would destroy Tony Delucci without killing him, extract a price so devastating that it would serve as a warning to anyone else the Italians might send, all while maintaining plausible deniability. After all, he was just asking for compensation for a pair of ruined shoes. Tony left Vincenzo's that night feeling triumphant. He met with 2 of his crew members at a bar in Little Italy, telling them how Bumpy had sat there silent, how the great Harlem boss had done nothing while a Gambino soldier poured wine on his shoes. Tony's friends bought him drinks, celebrated the insult as a victory. They were all young, all convinced that their connection to the Italian families made them untouchable. The celebration lasted 2 days. On the 3rd day, 2 men Tony had never seen before walked into Delucci's, the family restaurant Tony's father Sal ran on Mulberry Street. They didn't order food, so they asked for Tony by name. Tony came out from the kitchen, recognized immediately that these weren't neighborhood people. They had the bearing of professionals, the kind of men who worked for organizations that didn't advertise their business. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter, with cold eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw. Tony Delucci, the shorter man, said, "We're here on behalf of Mr. Johnson." He placed a white envelope on the table. "He asked us to deliver this personally." Tony opened the envelope, expecting a threat, maybe a warning to leave Harlem alone. Instead, he found a bill. The document was typed on professional letterhead, formatted like an invoice from a law firm. It itemized the damaged property: 1 pair of custom Florentine suede shoes, handmade in Italy, one of only 2 pairs in existence. The leather was described as rare Tuscan suede from a tannery that had closed in 1958, making replacement impossible. The compensation demanded wasn't just for the shoes themselves. The invoice included charges for the insult delivered in front of witnesses, the inconvenience of having to leave the restaurant with damaged footwear, and what the document called reputational maintenance costs. The total came to $50,000. Tony read the number 3 times. $50,000. He looked up at the 2 men, about to laugh, about to tell them that Bumpy Johnson must be joking. Then he saw their faces and understood they weren't joking at all. "You have 2 weeks," the shorter man said. "Mr. Johnson expects full payment in cash. He also wants you to know that he understands you are following orders. He holds no personal animosity. This is simply business. The disrespect has a price. The price is $50,000. After the men left, Tony sat alone at the table, trying to understand what had just happened. $50,000 wasn't just a large sum. It was a catastrophic amount. More money than most legitimate businesses earned in years. Bumpy Johnson knew exactly what he was doing. He had created a debt that Tony couldn't possibly pay, forcing him into an impossible position. Tony's first instinct was to go to his capo, the man who had given him the assignment to insult Bumpy. He drove to a social club in Brooklyn where the higher-ranking members of the Gambino family conducted business. His capo, Frank Russo, listened to Tony's explanation with an expression that grew increasingly cold. "You're telling me that Bumpy Johnson is demanding $50,000 for a pair of shoes?" Frank asked. Tony nodded, handed over the invoice. Frank read it, then looked at Tony with something between disgust and pity. "And you thought this was a good idea? You thought pouring wine on the man's shoes in front of witnesses was going to end well?" Tony started to explain that Frank himself had approved the plan, that the order had come from higher up. Frank cut him off. "I told you to send a message. Didn't tell you to be stupid about it. You made it personal." You smiled at him. Now he's making it personal back, and you're asking me to clean up your mess. The conversation that followed made Tony's situation clear. The Gambino family would not pay the $50,000. They viewed this as Tony's problem, the result of his arrogance and poor execution. Frank explained the politics bluntly. If the family paid Bumpy's demand, it would look like the Italians were backing down, that Harlem could extract tribute from made men with impunity. That couldn't be allowed, but they also wouldn't go to war with Bumpy over this. The leadership had already discussed the situation. Bumpy was within his rights to seek compensation for the insult. The amount was outrageous, but that was negotiable. What wasn't negotiable was the family's decision that Tony would handle this himself. "You wanted to be a tough guy," Frank said. "If you wanted to show off, now you deal with the consequences. Figure out how to pay him, or figure out how to make him accept less. But don't come back here asking for money we're not going to give you." Tony left the social club understanding that he had been cut loose. The organization that he thought made him powerful had abandoned him to face Bumpy Johnson alone. He had 2 weeks to produce $50,000, and every conventional source of that money had just disappeared. He drove back to Little Italy, parked outside his father's restaurant, and sat in the car for an hour, trying to think of any possible solution. Nothing came. Finally, he went inside and told his father what had happened. Sal Delucci listened in silence, and when Tony finished, his father asked the only question that mattered. "Where are we supposed to get $50,000? Sal Delucci had built his restaurant over 32 years through careful management, relationships with suppliers, and a reputation for honest business. Unlike his son, Sal had never been involved in organized crime beyond paying the necessary protection money to operate in Little Italy. He ran a legitimate restaurant, paid his taxes, and raised his family on modest but stable income. The restaurant owned its equipment outright. Commercial stoves, refrigerators, cookware, tables, chairs, and furnishings accumulated over 3 decades. The business had good credit with suppliers and a loyal customer base. In a normal situation, Sal could have borrowed against the restaurant or found investors, but this wasn't a normal situation. Sal sat down with his accountant to inventory everything the family owned. The restaurant equipment and furnishings had a liquidation value of approximately $12,000. The family's home, a brownstone Sal had purchased in 1945, had equity of about $18,000. Sal's savings and his wife Maria's jewelry added another $3,000. Altogether, if they liquidated every asset they owned, they could raise perhaps $35,000. That left a $15,000 gap. And that assumed they could sell everything quickly without taking desperate prices. The 2-week deadline made normal financing impossible. Banks wouldn't approve loans that quickly, and anyone who would lend that kind of money on short notice would charge interest rates that would cripple them. Tony's younger brothers, Marco and Vincent, both worked legitimate jobs. Marco as a construction foreman and Vincent as an accountant. Between them, they could contribute perhaps $5,000 in savings. That still left $10,000 short. The family meeting that night was the most painful conversation Sal had ever participated in. His wife Maria cried quietly as they discussed selling their home, the place where their children had grown up, where they had celebrated every holiday and milestone for 20 years. Marco argued they should refuse to pay that Bumpy Johnson. Couldn't actually force them to liquidate everything. Vincent, always the cautious one, pointed out that refusing meant facing consequences none of them wanted to imagine. Tony sat silent through most of it. This was his fault, his arrogance, his belief that being a made man made him invincible. His family was about to lose everything because he had wanted to prove himself to men who had now abandoned him. Sal made the decision. Atay would liquidate everything they could, raise as much money as possible, and approach Bumpy Johnson to negotiate the remaining balance. It was the only option that didn't involve walking away from the debt entirely, which Sal's sense of honor wouldn't allow even if the debt itself was unjust. Sal Delucci had lived in New York long enough to know people who knew people. Through contacts in Little Italy, he arranged a meeting with one of Bumpy's intermediaries, a man named James who handled business negotiations for the Harlem organization. The meeting took place in a coffee shop on the border between Little Italy and Harlem, neutral territory where both men could talk without implied threats. Sal came with a proposal. He had liquidated the restaurant equipment borrowed against his home, and collected money from every source available to his family. He could offer $38,000 in cash immediately with a signed agreement to pay the remaining $12,000 over the next 2 years with interest. He brought documentation showing the full extent of his family's finances, proof that $38,000 represented everything they had. James listened politely, accepted the documents, and said he would present the offer to Mr. Johnson. 2 days later, he called Sal with Bumpy's response. The offer was rejected. Full payment only. $50,000. 2 weeks. Sal tried to explain the impossibility of the demand. James cut him off. Mr. Johnson understands your situation completely, James said. He knows exactly what your family is worth. The amount he's requesting wasn't random. It was calculated specifically to exceed what you can easily raise, forcing you to make difficult choices. Sal asked why. If Bumpy understood the situation, he wouldn't accept a reasonable compromise. James's answer was brutal in its honesty. "'Cause the point isn't the money. The point is the lesson. Your son walked into a restaurant representing the Italian families and deliberately disrespected Mr. Johnson in front of witnesses. That disrespect needs a response that everyone will hear about. One that makes it clear what happens when people treat Mr. Johnson as someone they can insult without consequence." The conversation ended with James offering one piece of advice. "You have 12 days left. I suggest you find the money. Mr. Johnson doesn't make idle threats, and he doesn't forget debts. If you can't pay, the alternatives are worse than bankruptcy." Hung up the phone, understanding that negotiation was impossible. Bumpy Johnson had set a price that would destroy the Delucci family, and he had done it deliberately. The only question now was whether they could somehow find the remaining $12,000 before the deadline. With conventional options exhausted, Tony turned to the only sources of quick money available to a connected guy who had been cut off by his organization: loan sharks, gamblers, and criminals who operated outside the established families. These were dangerous people who charged devastating interest rates and used violence to collect debts. But Tony had run out of safer alternatives. He borrowed $5,000 from a loan shark named Eddie Corso, who operated out of the Bronx. The terms were simple: 20% interest per week, compounding. The first payment of $1,000 would be due 7 days after receiving the money. Failure to pay would result in broken bones escalating to worse consequences if the debt continued. Another $3,000 came from selling stolen merchandise through fences Tony knew from his time running small crews. He moved televisions, jewelry, and other goods taken in burglaries he hadn't personally committed but could help sell. The profit margins were thin, and every transaction increased his exposure to law enforcement. 2,000 more came from Marco Delucci, who took out a second mortgage on a small property he owned in Queens. Vincent contributed $1,500 from his retirement savings. Family, friends, people who had known the Deluccis for years contributed small amounts when Sal explained the situation, though he left out the details of why they needed the money. So desperately, by the 13th day, the family had assembled $48,000. They were $2,000 short with 1 day remaining. Sal made the decision to mortgage the family home beyond its equity, finding a predatory lender who would give them the final $2,000 at rates that would eventually consume the property entirely. On the 14th day, Tony counted the full $50,000 3 times to be certain. The money came from so many sources, represented so many destroyed futures, that he could barely comprehend what his arrogance had cost. The restaurant was gone, stripped of equipment, and about to close. His parents' home would be foreclosed within the year. His own debt to Eddie Corso would grow faster than he could possibly pay it. Marco had leveraged his only property. Vincent had emptied his savings. The Gambino family, the organization Tony thought would protect him, had offered nothing. Frank Russo hadn't even returned Tony's calls during the final week. The message was clear. Tony Delucci had embarrassed the family with his sloppy execution and was now facing the consequences alone that evening. Tony received a call with instructions for the payment. He was to come to a warehouse in Harlem at midnight, alone with the full amount in cash. The voice on the phone was calm and professional, treating this like a normal business transaction rather than the destruction of a family's entire life. Tony arrived at the warehouse on 135th Street 15 minutes early, carrying a leather duffel bag with $50,000 in cash. The building was dark except for a single light over a side entrance. He parked his car on the street and waited, watching for any sign of movement. At midnight exactly, 2 cars pulled into the lot. 4 men emerged, the same 2 who had delivered the original demand plus 2 others Tony didn't recognize. The shorter man who had spoken before approached while the others waited by the cars. "You have the money?" the man asked. Tony nodded, held up the bag. Full amount. $50,000. The man gestured toward the light. "Bring it inside." Okay. Tony followed him into the warehouse. The interior was mostly empty, just concrete floors and steel beams supporting the roof. In the center of the space, under the only working light, Bumpy Johnson sat in a chair, smoking a cigarette. This was the first time Tony had seen Bumpy since the night at Vincenzo's. The older man looked completely calm, as if this were a casual evening rather than the culmination of 2 weeks of destruction. Bumpy gestured to a table beside him. "Put it there," he said. Tony placed the bag on the table. One of Bumpy's men opened it and began counting the money, stacking bills in organized piles while everyone waited in silence. The counting took nearly 20 minutes. When it was finished, the man nodded to Bumpy. 50,000 exact. Bumpy stood up and walked over to Tony, stopping a few feet away. "Do you understand why this happened?" he asked. Tony wanted to say yes, to show that he had learned something from this disaster, but he stayed silent. Bumpy continued anyway. "You came into that restaurant thinking you were tough. You thought being a made man meant you could disrespect anybody, that your organization would back you up no matter what you did. You were wrong on both counts. Being connected doesn't make you powerful. It makes you useful until you stop being useful. Then you're alone. Bumpy walked back to his chair and sat down. I knew the moment you smiled at me that someone sent you. I knew this was a test from the Italians, seeing if I would tolerate disrespect from one of their soldiers. So I sent a message back. Not to you, you don't matter. To the people who sent you. The message is simple. Harlem isn't your territory. The people here aren't your subjects. And if you send another punk kid to test me, the price will be higher next time. He waved his hand in dismissal. Take your family and disappear. I don't want to see you in Harlem again. I don't want to hear your name in connection with anything that happens in this neighborhood. You're done. Go. Tony walked out of the warehouse, got in his car, and drove back to Little Italy. He had paid the debt, survived the encounter, and lost everything. Delucci's restaurant closed permanently 3 weeks after Tony delivered the money to Bumpy Johnson. Without the equipment they had sold, without the operating capital that had see Heidi, and went to see Haite, and lost everything, and lost everything, and lost everything. Delucci's restaurant closed, while Sihai resieged, with Hihai's well alode. While Haisai reselve, we lead our lies, we lead Sihai, we lead Sihai. While Sihai, we lead Sihais, we lead Sihai, we lead Sihai, we lead Sihais, we lead Sihai. We lead Sihai, you lead Sihai, I lead Salihai, so you lead Sihai, I lead Sihai, I lead you, I lead economy, idol, I knew, I hope you die, sigh, we, you say, you did sat that gone to paying the debt. Continuing was impossible. Sal locked the door on a business his father had started 32 years earlier. The family home in Little Italy went into foreclosure 4 months later when Sal couldn't make the mortgage payments on the predatory loan he had taken to complete the $50,000. The Deluccis moved to a rented apartment in Queens, leaving behind the neighborhood where they had lived for 2 generations. Tony's debt to Eddie, of course, compounded faster than he could pay it. The $1,000 weekly payments became impossible. After the second month, Eddie's collectors came looking for Tony, found him, and broke 3 fingers on his right hand as a warning. The message was clear. Pay or the consequences would escalate. Tony went to Frank Russo one final time, begging for help with the loan shark debt. Frank listened, then told Tony he was being officially removed from the Gambino family. He wasn't being killed, which would have been the traditional response to someone who had caused this kind of embarrassment, but he was out. No protection, no support, no connection to the organization. Tony Delucci was a civilian now, facing his debts. Alone. Marco Delucci lost his property in Queens when he couldn't keep up with the second mortgage payments. Vincent's retirement savings were gone entirely. Maria's health deteriorated from the stress, developing heart problems that would affect her for the rest of her life. The family that had been stable and secure was scattered and broken. The only mercy was that Bumpy Johnson kept his word. Once the debt was paid, he left the Delucci family alone. No further demands, no additional revenge. The message had been sent, received, and understood throughout New York's criminal world. The story spread quickly. An arrogant young Italian mobster had tried to disrespect Bumpy Johnson, and Bumpy had bankrupted his entire family without ever raising his voice or firing a shot. Tony found work as a laborer on construction sites, the kind of jobs he had looked down on when he was a made man. He worked for cash under the table, avoiding Eddie Corso's collectors when he could, paying them when he couldn't avoid the encounters. The fingers they had broken never healed properly. The arrogance he had carried at 28 was gone by 30, replaced by the understanding that respect and fear are different things, and he had confused one for the other. The story of Tony Delucci and the $50,000 cleaning bill became legend in both Harlem and Little Italy, told differently depending on which neighborhood you heard it in. In Harlem, it was proof that Bumpy Johnson commanded respect. That transcended organizational boundaries, that even the Italian families learned not to test him. In Little Italy, it was a cautionary tale about arrogance, about what happens when young guys think being connected makes them invincible. Bumpy Johnson never mentioned the incident publicly, but people who knew him understood its significance. The Italian families had sent Tony to test whether Bumpy would tolerate disrespect from a made man. Bumpy's response established that he wouldn't, and he would extract a price so severe that no one would try again. The fact that he had done it without starting a war, without killing anyone, demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that made him dangerous. The Italian families, for their part, learned their lesson. They stopped attempting to encroach on Harlem's operations. The boundary at 110th Street became more firmly established, respected by both sides. Bumpy Johnson's independence was acknowledged, and the uneasy peace between the organizations stabilized. All of it because Tony Delucci had poured wine on a pair of shoes and smiled. For the Delucci family, the consequences never ended. Sal died. In 1970, 7 years after losing his restaurant. Working as a line cook in someone else's kitchen until a heart attack took him at 63. Maria lived another decade. But her health never recovered from the stress of 1963. Marco rebuilt slowly, eventually buying a small shop in Queens. But he never regained what he had lost helping his brother. Tony himself worked construction jobs for 15 years before a fall from a scaffold left him partially disabled. He ended up on disability payments, living alone in a studio apartment in the Bronx, supporting himself on government assistance. The arrogant young mobster who had thought he could insult Bumpy Johnson with impunity became a cautionary tale. His name used by older gangsters to warn younger ones about the cost of disrespect. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, 5 years after the incident with Tony Delucci. His obituary mentioned his criminal empire, his time in prison, his complex role in Harlem's history. It didn't mention the Italian waiter, or the wine, or the $50,000. That story lived in oral tradition, passed between generations of criminals as both sides learned what happens when respect is tested. When boundaries are crossed, and when men mistake their organization's power for their own. The wine stain washed out, the debt was paid. But some costs, once incurred, echo through lifetimes.